In 2014, a sermon clip went viral. Not because of what Joel Osteen said, because of what his wife said standing right next to him. Victoria Osteen looked into the camera and told millions of people that when you worship God, you're not really doing it for God, you're doing it for yourself, because that's what makes God happy. The clip exploded. Theologians called it heresy. Pastors called it the prosperity gospel taken to its logical extreme, and defenders said it was taken out of context. But here's what most people missed in the outrage. That sermon wasn't an accident. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a window into something that had been building at Lakewood Church for years. A philosophy that puts Victoria Osteen at the center of one of the largest religious empires in America, with the title of co-pastor, the influence of a spiritual leader, and almost zero accountability for either. And to understand why that matters, you need to know what happened on Continental Airlines. Flight 1602, December 2005. Houston to Vail, Colorado. First-class cabin. Victoria Osteen boards the plane with her family. They're heading to a ski vacation. The flight is delayed on the tarmac, and according to multiple witnesses, Victoria notices something on her armrest. A small stain, maybe liquid, maybe food. The accounts vary. What happens next doesn't vary. Victoria calls over a flight attendant named Sharon Brown. She wants the stain cleaned. Brown says she'll get to it, but the plane is preparing for takeoff, and she needs to finish her safety duties first. This is where the stories diverge, but not by much. According to Sharon Brown, Victoria became irate, wouldn't accept waiting. According to the lawsuit filed later, Victoria pushed Brown against a bathroom door, elbowed her in the chest, and left her with the hemorrhoids that required medical attention. According to one witness, Victoria said she was a Christian and she demanded to be treated with respect. According to Victoria's attorneys, she never touched anyone. According to Joel Osteen, his wife was simply being assertive. What isn't disputed is what happened next. The pilot made a decision. He turned the plane around. He returned to the gate. And Victoria Osteen, co-pastor of the largest megachurch in America, was removed from the flight. The FAA fined her $3,000 for interfering with a crew member. Now, you might think this is where the story ends. Rich person behaves badly on an airplane, pays a fine. We've seen it before. But Sharon Brown wasn't finished. In 2008, she filed a civil lawsuit against Victoria Osteen. She wanted $400,000 in compensatory damages for her injuries. She wanted punitive damages, and she wanted 10% of Victoria's net worth. Her reasoning was simple. She believed Victoria Osteen had assaulted her, humiliated her, and then used her wealth and influence to minimize what happened. The trial became a spectacle. Lakewood's PR team worked overtime. Supporters packed the courtroom wearing "We Love Victoria" buttons. The defense argued Sharon Brown was exaggerating for a payday. The jury sided with Victoria. They found her not liable. But something interesting happened during that trial. Something that got less attention than the verdict. Victoria Osteen testified under oath. And when asked about the incident, she said she couldn't remember pushing anyone. She couldn't remember making physical contact. But she also couldn't explain why the pilot removed her from the plane. She couldn't explain why multiple witnesses described aggressive behavior. And she couldn't explain why she paid the FAA fine without contesting it if nothing had happened. The jury believed her. Or at least, they didn't believe Sharon Brown enough to award damages. But the court of public opinion works differently than a courtroom. And what people remembered wasn't the verdict. It was the image. a woman worth millions, flying first class to a ski vacation, allegedly shoving a flight attendant over a stain on an armrest, a co-pastor of a church that preaches humility and service, reportedly telling airline staff she deserved respect because she was a Christian. The Osteens never publicly apologized. They called the incident a misunderstanding. They moved on, but Sharon Brown didn't move on. In interviews years later, she maintained her account. She said she was telling the truth. She said money couldn't buy her silence. And she said she hoped people would remember what kind of person Victoria Osteen showed herself to be on that airplane. 6 years later, they got another reminder. The 2014 sermon clip wasn't recorded by a critic. It wasn't leaked by a disgruntled employee. It was broadcast by Lakewood Church itself on their own platform to their own congregation. Victoria Osteen stood at the pulpit and delivered what she clearly believed was an encouraging message. She said, and these are her exact words, "I just want to encourage every one of us to realize when we obey God, we're not doing it for God. I mean, that's one way to look at it. We're doing it for ourselves because God takes pleasure when we're happy. That's the thing that gives him the greatest joy. So I want you to know this morning, just do good for your own self. Do good because God wants you to be happy. When you come to church, when you worship him, you're not doing it for God, really. You're doing it for yourself because that's what makes God happy." Joel Osteen stood right next to her, nodding. The backlash was immediate. Christian leaders from across denominations called it narcissistic theology. They said it inverted the entire message of Christianity, which teaches that worship is about glorifying God, not satisfying yourself. They pointed to centuries of teaching that explicitly contradicts what Victoria said. Lakewood's response was familiar. Context, misunderstanding, taken out of proportion. But here's the thing about that defense. Watch the full sermon. The context doesn't help. Victoria wasn't making a nuanced theological point that got clipped unfairly. She was expressing a worldview that puts human happiness at the center of spiritual practice, a worldview that makes God a supporting character in your personal story of success and comfort. And when you combine that sermon with the airplane incident, a pattern emerges. This is a person who reportedly demanded immediate service from a flight attendant because her comfort mattered more than crew safety protocols. This is a person who told a global audience that worship is actually about making yourself happy. This is a person who carries the title of co-pastor at a church that seats 16,000 people, a church that broadcasts to millions, a church that brings in hundreds of millions in donations. And she has no formal theological training, no seminary degree, no ordination process, no accountability structure that exists outside her own family. The title of co-pastor at Lakewood Church wasn't earned through education or credentialing. It was created. Victoria Osteen became co-pastor because Joel Osteen said so. Because the church they run together decided she should have that title. Now, to be fair, many religious traditions don't require formal credentials. Many churches elevate leaders based on calling rather than degrees. That's a legitimate theological position. But most churches also have accountability structures, boards of elders, denominational oversight, processes for addressing concerns about leadership behavior. Lakewood Church is non-denominational. It answers to no outside authority. The board is largely composed of people personally connected to the Osteens. When Victoria Osteen was removed from that airplane, there was no church disciplinary process. When she delivered that sermon, there was no theological review. When critics raised concerns, there was no independent body to evaluate them. The accountability structure at Lakewood Church is the Osteen family, and the Osteen family has decided that Victoria Osteen is doing just fine. This matters because of scale. Lakewood Church isn't a small congregation. It's one of the largest religious organizations in America. It influences millions of people's understanding of Christianity. It shapes how people think about faith, about prosperity, about what God wants for their lives. And one of the two people leading that organization has demonstrated, on camera and under oath, a pattern of behavior that contradicts basic principles of humility and service. The flight attendant incident wasn't just an embarrassing moment. It was a window into how Victoria Osteen treats people when she doesn't get what she wants. The 2014 sermon wasn't just a gaffe. It was a thesis statement about what she believes faith is actually for. Some defenders argue that we're holding Victoria to an unfair standard, that everyone has bad days, that a stressful flight and an awkward sermon don't define a person. But that argument cuts both ways. If Victoria Osteen were a private citizen, the airplane incident would be embarrassing, but ultimately personal. If she were a motivational speaker, the sermon would be controversial, but theologically irrelevant. But she's not a private citizen. She's not a motivational speaker. She holds the title of co-pastor at one of the most influential churches in the world. She speaks to millions of people about God and faith and how to live. She shapes the spiritual formation of countless families. Leaders are held to higher standards because they accepted higher responsibility. That's not unfair. That's the job. The Osteens have built an empire on positivity, on encouragement, on the message that God wants you to live your best life now. That message has resonated with millions of people who feel beaten down by traditional religion, who want faith without guilt, who want a God who's on their side. But there's a shadow side to that message. When your theology centers on personal happiness, what happens when serving others makes you uncomfortable? When your faith is about what God can do for you, what happens when someone else's needs conflict with your wants? The airplane incident suggests an answer. So does the sermon. And the lack of accountability at Lakewood means these questions will never be formally addressed. There's no mechanism for it. There's no process. There's only the Osteens and what they decide to do. To be absolutely clear, this isn't about attacking someone's faith. Victoria Osteen may be a sincere believer. She may genuinely want to help people. She may have had legitimate reasons for frustration on that airplane that we'll never fully understand. But the facts are the facts. She was removed from a flight for her behavior. She was fined by the FAA. She delivered a sermon that theologians across traditions called a distortion of Christian teaching. And she holds a title that comes with immense influence and almost no external accountability. Those facts don't require judgment. They just require attention. Because when you watch Joel Osteen at that pulpit, smiling and delivering his message of hope, it's easy to forget that there's someone standing right next to him. Someone with equal authority. Someone who has shown, in documented moments, what that authority looks like when it's tested. Victoria Osteen isn't a supporting character in the Lakewood story. She's a co-author, and the chapters she's written deserve the same scrutiny as her husband's. The question isn't whether Victoria Osteen is a good person. That's between her and God, as she might say. The question is whether someone with her documented pattern of behavior should hold the title of co-pastor at one of the most influential churches in America, with no accountability structure beyond her own family. That's not a question of faith. It's a question of leadership. And it's a question Lakewood Church has never been required to answer. Sharon Brown, the flight attendant, eventually moved on with her life. She lost her lawsuit. She didn't get her day of vindication in court. But she also never changed her story. To this day, she maintains that Victoria Osteen assaulted her on that airplane. That money and influence protected someone who should have been held accountable. We'll probably never know the complete truth of what happened in that first-class cabin, but we know what happened after. We know about the fine. We know about the lawsuit. We know about the sermon that came 6 years later. And we know that Victoria Osteen is still standing at that pulpit every Sunday, telling millions of people what God wants for their lives. If you found this breakdown valuable, hit subscribe. I cover stories like this every week, examining the gap between what institutions claim and what the documentation shows. The truth isn't always comfortable, but it's always worth knowing.